The session doesn't have a heading, but the commonality for these three papers is that they deal with migration, they deal with Israel, and they deal with Israel in all directions, as an immigrant receiving country, as an immigrant sending country, and those that are in between, as we will hear. Or I should say both, not in between. So the first presentation, as you see here, is given by Professor Larissa Remennick. She's the chair of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Bar-Ilan University. For a quarter of a century, she's been studying different facets of the encounter between the Soviet Jews and the receiving Israeli society. Her current research focuses primarily on what she calls the 1.5 generation, the youth that has migrated and is integrating in one way or another into Israeli society. Her book, Russian Jews on Three Continents, Identity, Integration, and Conflict, came out by transaction in 2007, and then again in 2012, has become a common reference in the fields of immigration and Jewish studies. So Larissa, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. Do you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, good. So I'm going to introduce you to the phenomenon that is universal. It exists across all immigration receiving nations, but in the Israeli society it is particularly prominent and pivotal because this cohort is very large and has an influence on the receiving society. I'm speaking about generation 1.5. And in the next frame I will introduce this particular concept in immigration research. But as a brief explanation of what I'm going to do in the 20 minutes that I have, my task is almost impossible because I'm dying to compress the 7 or 8 years of research into this very brief lecture, trying to pull up the qualitative studies, the ethnographic studies that we've done for the last 5 years approximately, and a recent survey in this particular group of immigrants. So it will be both in-depth and statistical a little bit on the tendencies and changes between generation 1.5 and generation of their parents, the first immigrant generation, okay? And it's, of course, in a nutshell and in a snapshot, it's just a brief taste of the topic. So those who are interested can ask me for references, and I will gladly send you my papers. Okay, why wouldn't it go? Okay, here it is. So who are those Russian-Israeli 1.5ers? They moved to Israel with their families as all the children are adolescents, approximately between the ages of 9 to 18, school age, largely, leaving behind friends, familiar environment, secure homes, mostly during the large wave of the 90s, the wave that's known the Great Russian Aliyah. Now, the scholars point out, social psychologists, therapists, that adolescence is probably the worst age to migrate, to change the country, to change the school, to change the peer group, to change the whole environment and setting of your life, especially when you did not want to uproot and go to another country. And of course, most children and adolescents acted on the decision of their parents. It was not their wish to come to another country, so very often they're miserable and exposed to multiple problems in the new country, particularly at school, but not only at school. The older they are, the more difficult this transplantation is. It's particularly difficult to migrate at the age of 13, 14 plus in middle school and high school, because of course the schooling curriculum is different, particularly the difference between Russian schools and Israeli Hebrew schools is in language, is in curriculum, is in school culture, in the whole habitus of school, relations between teachers and students and parents. It's all very, very different. So it's a big upheaval in the lives of those young girls and boys. And it took them a while to get adjusted and, even survive. And many of them had to drop out from high school completing it with minimal matriculation that did not allow them to continue to college or university. At the same time, those young girls and boys had to experience very early independence and pretty much grew themselves up in the new country because the parents had very little capacity to help them and to pay attention at them, being immersed in their own immigration troubles on the labor market, on trying to survive on very low income, juggling different jobs, and being very little at home with their children. Now, if we make fast forward to now, 20, 25 years later, we're here dealing with the whole cohort of young adults, approximately between the ages of 25 and 40 today. They are estimated at about 160,000, plus minus. It depends where you put the cutoff points in terms of the age of entry. But it's a very heavy chunk of young Israeli adults of today that are of Russian origin. In the middle of their own careers and family building, because those are the ages when all these things come together. And most of them have passed the normative Israeli life tracks. They finished high school, they served in the military. Most of them, about half, have higher education, completed colleges, and started their careers. Many of them already have families of their own. So we're speaking here about a large cohort of young Israelis, and we're trying to build up the social portrait by using both in-depth, ethnographic, qualitative, and quantitative tools. I'm trying to figure out who they are and how they compare to the generation of their parents. Okay? They are very different from their parents in terms of the last two lines, their sense of entitlement for equality. Because their parents were a very silent and timid immigrant generation. They did not show much civic activity or protest activity, despite being treated not so nicely by the Israeli society, experiencing multiple problems on the Israeli labor market and housing market, and being very much exploited and discarded. Their human capital being wasted very often, because just about 1/3 of them managed to regain their careers and to continue working in Israel in line with their education and knowledge base. And the majority had to make a living with manual or service labor. So the parental generation had a very hard time accommodating to the Israeli society, and the children's generation is not willing to continue in the same path. They are much more driven by the sense of magiali, by the sense of entitlement, by the sense of belonging to the Israeli mainstream, to the Jewish majority, and that they don't see any reason why they should have lesser rights or lesser achievements than their Sabra Israeli-born peers. So I will briefly depict our series of ethnographic studies. We've published about 7 articles about that with my colleague Anna Prashitsky. We went out to study organizations, the groups that those young Russian Israeli adults have been forming over the last 7 or 8 years. And there are many groups like that, driven by the theoretical lens of immigrant generations, of course, the first, the 1.5, the second, and the differences between them. And the frame of context of reception that are very important in, shaping the lives of every immigrant generation. And also the ideas about reactive ethnicity. This is the way that young immigrants very often respond to the perceived discrimination, inequality that they are not willing to tolerate like their parents did. We studied the leaders, the activists of this young cohort of Russian Israelis, whom you can call ethnic cultural entrepreneurs or brokers, okay, that are active in the cultural public sphere of the Israeli society, and they represent their cohort, although they are a small minority of that cohort, because the majority is still quite immersed in their private lives and their economic problems and, regular experiences of young adults in every country. In terms of comparisons, it's very interesting to juxtapose this research to the studies about second-generation Turkish immigrants in Germany, for example, or Latino youth in the United States. There are some similarities and, of course, some differences. First and foremost, because the young adults who are talking about belong to the Israeli Jewish majority, and hence are not seeing themselves as a minority, right? Although in a way they are a minority, but it's a very twisted position. They are both a majority and a minority at the same time. Some pictures just to, to give you a feeling, an epiphany of our ethnographic work. Those are the products of the activity of the association called Fishka. It was a very active club or society for young immigrants that existed in southern Tel Aviv for 7 years. Among other events, they organized alternative street weddings for members of their own generation 1.5 who cannot get married in the rabbinical court because they're not recognized as Jews by the Orthodox rules. So they offered an alternative in the form of street weddings that also became festivals of protest against the Orthodox domination of marital law and the lack of separation between religion and state in Israel. So this couple is getting married in this street wedding. You can see that they also have a 1-year-old child, so they've been together for some time. It will be a little problematic to get them wedded under chuppah in the rabbinical court. But then, of course, they are both half Jews on the wrong side, so this is out of question anyway. This is the demonstration or festival that was organized by Fishka to introduce the International Women's Day to the Israeli calendar or schedule, because this is a holiday that does not exist in Israel, and it was very popular in the Soviet Union. So a young group of volunteers from Fishka just, went along the streets in southern Tel Aviv in a bad, rundown, poor area of the city. They were giving flowers to people and balloons and, and explaining them about this holiday. And so the crowd got larger and larger. And so some people from Tel Aviv, in southern Tel Aviv, got to know what the 8th of March is and what's the meaning of the International Women's Day. And the last picture is about the hybrid kinds of holiday celebrations that they organized. It's a Russian Mimuna celebration. The Israelis here, of course, know that Mimuna is a Moroccan holiday. This is the last day of the Passover, the breaking of the Passover and getting back to the routine. So it was a culinary festival that met together Russian blinches and Moroccan mufleta, which is a sweet pastry prepared by Moroccan Jews to end the Passover when we do not eat leavened bread, of course. So this is the kind of public events that try to build bridges between the Russian-Israeli young adults and the majority that surrounds them in Tel Aviv, in particular in the urban space that they belong. So it was also getting back to our own culture and bridging to the local Israeli cultures. Now, after dealing for many years in our studies with the activist groups, we wanted to try to build a broader picture and to see what kind of mindsets and social tendencies are found among regular Russian-Israeli young adults who are not involved in movements, in groups, who are not cultural entrepreneurs of their generation, rank and file young men and women who came here as teenagers or older children and grew up here in this country. So we wanted to know how they identify as Israelis and as Jews, what is their political outlook, generational ties with their parents, perceived discrimination as an immigrant group, a minority in a way, generally to sketch out their portrait. So we ran an online survey via social networks in the fall of last year, and 650 respondents filled the questionnaire. The quota was stratified. We did the recruitment trying to build strata by gender, age, and location, geography. So it turned out not so bad. Of course, it's all internet samples are very selective. and there's nothing to do about that, but there is no other practical way to collect a significant number of responses from this category of young Israelis. So we were fairly satisfied with the composition of our sample. It was somewhat biased towards the women, which is also very common because women are much more cooperative with social researchers. They are more willing to fill in questionnaires, particularly about social issues. And the sample was also a little biased towards higher educated respondents, about 70%. 39% live in greater Tel Aviv area, which also typifies residential patterns of young, educated, middle-class Israelis who tend to move from smaller outlying towns, what we call the periphery of Israel, to greater Tel Aviv area, which is a huge magnet and the hub for young adults who want to make something of their lives. The mean age was 33, a little bit more, and the mean age at arrival at Aliyah was 12.2, and 66% were already married. So I'm giving you a very brief snapshot of findings, just 5 minutes left. Social mobility, what happened to this generation vis-a-vis their parents, okay? There is continuity in their values because higher education remain a very central life goal, and the rates of higher education among the young adults are similar to those of their parents, who are very highly educated, as we know. Occupational structure is dominated by what we call STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, pragmatic occupational choices, medicine, finance, and only a minority go towards humanities, social sciences, or all kinds of weird and non-practical choices that do not promise stable jobs and income. And this is typical for all immigrants everywhere. They usually go into very pragmatic fields of majors that promise income. Middle-class locations, 42% reported higher than average income, which is very nice. Relatively high work satisfaction and perceived living standards of this cohort are higher than those of their parents. There was a question asking, do you think that your living standards are higher than those of your parents? About 60% said yes. Home ownership is relatively low, slightly above third, but this is a common problem that reflects very high real estate prices over the last decade, so it's across the lines. And then, importantly and sadly, over 50% are open to explore work and study opportunities abroad if a good opportunity comes by, and only 39% said that they're sure to stay in Israel for good. Jewish and Israeli identity. Well, this generation of Israelis is known for a permanent stigma or suspect status of their Jewishness due to their tenuous Jewish identity, secular lifestyle, and mixed origins sometimes, not having a Jewish mother. So in this sample, 30% were not recognized as Jews by halacha, and over 70% identified as secular or atheist, which is a common trend. Only about 25% attached any sentimental value to Jewish traditions. They felt strongly or somehow about Jewish traditions. But at the same time, 2/3 celebrated major Jewish holidays. And for example, 80% had their sons circumcised. So they comply with the norms of being Israeli Jew. But that does not necessarily mean that they got any closer to religion or religious traditions than their parents. Just 45% of those married had the Orthodox marriage with the chuppah, and the same number married abroad because they could not marry in Israel because of the religious limitation, while 10% cohabitate without marriage. Political and civic locations. This is an interesting block of issues because the parental generation is well known for its leaning to the right-wing part of the political spectrum in Israel. And in the younger generation, we see a much wider dispersion of political outlooks, with about half being close to their parents and 15% central left and 12% left. So we see that this is not an exclusive right-wing political outlook that was typical of their parents. More of them volunteer, more of them participated in some kind of street protests or rallies, but only 10% ever worked for any political parties. So the level of on-the-ground politics participation is still low. Most report positive or neutral views on feminism and LGBT rights, which is again a big shift from the parental generation. Well, I don't have much to spell on about ties with the parents and Russian affinity. You can just briefly see that continuity is present, and quite many of them report preference for co-ethnics in friendships and romantic relationships. About 70% in this sample are married to people of the same origin, so it's still lingering, this preference for the co-ethnic sociality. Conclusions, immigrant 1.5ers versus their parents. Generation 1.5 feels confident in its Israeli identity, entitled for inclusion and upward mobility, resent the glass ceiling and any kind of discrimination that they can experience, and are prone to reactive ethnicity. When they feel being discriminated, they respond with protest, self-organizing, and they no longer keep silent. Many recover their Russianness after years of concealing it at school, in the army, and see it as a resource, not a liability. They are proud of being Russian. They speak Russian, they think that their Russian language is good, they no longer refrain from speaking Russian in public places, etc. Their civic and political attitudes are more varied than their parents, but de facto political participation and civic activism is still quite low, which is typical of ex-Soviets generally. Challenges they face are both similar and different from those of their Sabra peers, and I could, elaborate on this, but there is no time. They are an inseparable part of young Israeli middle classes, and they share the same challenges and the same issues and problems as other young Israelis do, but sometimes more so. Thank you.
Since the papers are quite different, I suggest we take a couple of questions after each paper, so it's also fresh in our minds. If there are any questions or comments?
Wonderful presentation, and I know people from the 2.0 generation, so could you briefly compare the difference between these attitudes, the conclusions of what you found between the 1.5 and the 2.0? I mean, is it a trend in, say, politics, just to use one,
okay.
or politics and identity with Russianness?
I thought I've done that, but I was saying, like, all the Russian Israelis are. All the generation of Russian Israelis are almost exclusively right-wing voters. Okay, 80%. The second generation, we do not have much information about them. They're still too young. They're still in their school years.
People who made Aliyah in the 90s in the youth movement who came and then came here and had children, so they came as
children or adolescents between the ages of 9 and 18, approximately. School age. And those who were born here during the 90s, they are at school or in the army right now. There's very little research, and this is our next task when they grow a little older.
If you split those who are recognized as Jews by the Interior Ministry and those who are listed as others, then what kind of differences, do you find significant differences?
We did this analysis, yes.
Okay, so
yes.
What are the conclusions?
So those who are not recognized as Jews report higher perceived discrimination, more right-wing views, they are less lefty than Jews. They are all in pragmatic occupations, and making an income and a living is the most important for them. None of them are found in, humanities or liberal NGOs or activism or, things like that. There are more men than women in this category. They feel less connection to the Jewish traditions. They prefer Israeli identity to Jewish identity when we try different labels of identity. and they're more prone to leave than less inclined to stay here for life. And we know that immigration rates of people who are not recognized as Jews here are higher in practice. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. So 2 quick questions. One, does your survey include a question on citizenship, and what percentage have Russian or Ukrainian dual citizenship? And the second question, among the non-Jews, are there any practicing Christians or practicing Muslims?
In terms of religion, 2% said that they were Christians. 2%. 16% said they were spiritual but did not belong to any confession, and 72% were atheist or secular. Citizenship, about 30% have Russian or Ukrainian passport, and transnational ties with the former homelands are quite common. They go there quite often. They still have friends. They are in touch with their friends in Russia and Ukraine. Many have non-Jewish relatives who stayed there because it's mixed families. It's very important. So there is a human reason to sustain those ties. They go back and forth all the time. Yep.
Yes. What about marriage? Do they, this generation, tend to marry in their same class of people, or they marry with other Israelis that are not of Russian origin?
Yeah. Well, in this particular sample, like I said, it was very high rate of intermarriage between the people of Russian, in-group marriage with people of Russian origin. About 70% had spouses who also were children who came from the Soviet Union. But on average, I think it's a little less. It's about 60%, maybe. My guesstimate, because there is no such data, would be about 60%. 2/3 are married within the group, and 1/3 are married to suburbs or other immigrants.
Thank you very much.
Okay.